Hello and welcome to this episode of You're So Cool. On today's show we have movie and TV sound engineer and magic mixer of music, Mr. Michael Farrow. This episode is brought to you by our very good friends over at Geek Music, purveyors of some of the land's finest cover music from the world of movies, television, gaming and anime. So go and check out what they have to offer. And please, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, leave a comment or a suggestion for both Geek Music and us here at You're So Cool. We hope you enjoy today's show, so let's get on with it. So, Michael, can you tell our viewers your name and your job title?
Michael Farrow. I guess I mix the music. In my former career that I'm retired from, I was a scoring mixer. I recorded and mixed music for motion pictures primarily.
Can you name check some of the projects that you've worked on over the years and some of the composers that you've worked with?
I've done almost all of the Coen Brothers movies since Miller's Crossing. That was the first time I'd worked with Carter Burwell. I've worked with Carter for 35 years, I think. I've worked with a whole bunch of other people, Danny Elfman. I've done some Hans Zimmer movies, like I worked on Pirates of the Caribbean, or the Caribbean, I forget which. Worked on that movie, but I did Beauty and the Beast. I did the songs for Beauty and the Beast and the songs for Aladdin. That was back in the late 80s. Did those in New York before I moved to Los Angeles.
So can you tell us exactly what a sound engineer does and the role you play in the sound department?
Well, a sound engineer basically tries to get an idea of what the final product is going to be. So basically the mix starts during the initial conversation with the composer. You know, what are you trying to do here? What is it we're going to be winding up with? And based on that information, an engineer would select microphones, arrange the players in the studio, select the mode of recording. Mostly it's digital nowadays. It used to be analog, but now it's digital, almost always. And after all of those things are done, during the performance of the music, somebody like me would be saying, "Yeah, we need to do that again. The clarinet was flat." Of course, that's always written on the palm of my hand. Clarinet is flat, it's a given. Or the trumpets were too loud. That's also a given. That's on the other hand. But I make musical comments, and my goal during that process is to make the mix process as easy as possible, as transparent as possible, with as few fader moves as we can get by with. And the reason I do that is because if you get the performance right in the studio during the initial recording, then the band, the musical group, or the orchestra is what I think of, the orchestra will sound bigger and more natural. So that's what I try to do.
Speaking of Hans Zimmer and his work, today you have a lot of hybrid scores with both live instruments as well as electronic. So can you talk about whether you have to approach these elements differently?
Well, the synth elements can play a couple of different roles. One can be a clearly defined synth, which plays a more like a soloistic role, or it can be supporting the orchestral instrument. So you have to sort of figure out which is which and treat them like that. But if it's just a supporting thing, I try to make them blend so that it's not perceptible as a synth element. Not always possible to do. And then the other thing is when the synth plays a more soloistic role, you have to figure out what it's supposed to be doing. Like I said, the initial conversation with the composer will shed some light on that kind of stuff.
Now, in the older days of recording, most musicians would be recorded all together in the same room. But today, a lot of composers tend to record sections at a time and then blend them all together. So how do you feel about that, and how do you approach it differently?
My preference is to do everything live if it's possible. Not always possible to do. Like you might have what I call a misshapen orchestra, where you have a full brass section, full percussion section, and a tiny string section, and it's supposed to wind up sounding balanced. So it's not always possible to do all of that at once. But the things that you can do to mitigate that would be to use gobos or sound screens, so that you shelter the softer instruments from the louder ones. And that's one way to approach it. My preference is to do everything live because there is always a little subtle interaction among the players. For instance, in the terms of tuning, you might have two instruments that are technically in tune, but they don't quite match tonally. So if they're in the same room, they can say, I gotta make a slight modification here, and they will blend. Same thing for rhythm. You find that brass players and percussion players have a sort of a different idea of what rhythm is all about than the string players and the woodwind players. So if they're all in one room, it gets ironed out on the spot. If they're recorded separately, then a lot of adjustment later on is going to be necessary.
So tell us how you got into the industry and became a sound engineer, and was it something that you always wanted to do?
After college, I played trumpet in symphony orchestras for 11 years. That was my goal since I was 11 or 12 years old, is to be an orchestral musician playing trumpet. And I succeeded at that, but I decided that it was really not the right path for me. And I stayed up late one night saying, I got to change jobs. I got to change my career path here. What am I going to do? I know something about music, and I like listening to records. I know I'll be a recording engineer. So that's how I made the transition. That was in 1972. And I continued playing in the orchestra for another 3 years while working full-time at the studio. It was really quite a challenge. And then in 75, I quit the orchestra and went full-time at the studio. And during that period, this was in Indianapolis. That was my last orchestral job. And during that period, after 75, an arranger, an orchestrator would come from New York to do the high-priced things that we were doing out there, mostly jingles. And he would always walk out the door after the final thing was done, saying, Mike, we really need good recording engineers in New York. And I would say, oh, shucks. But then finally, one time I said, get me a job and I'll come to New York. And the next day the phone rang, and I picked it up, and the guy says, hello, this is Piers Plaskett. The other phone line rang, and I said, can I put you on hold for a second? Put him on hold. And it was Alan, the arranger from New York. He says, there's a guy going to be calling you. His name is Piers Plaskett. He's going to offer you a job. Well, gee, that's great. I'll come. And that's what happened. In 1978, I moved to New York. And I was doing primarily jingles, which was really wonderful because you got to deal with every possible musical style, written by every possible composer, arranged by every possible arranger, played by every possible musician in New York. And I got to say, the musicians that I worked with in New York on those projects were spectacular. Some of the best players I've ever known. Singers the same way. And it was really an easy job because everybody was doing their job perfectly, which made my job very easy. And so I really enjoyed doing that. Toward the end of the 80s, there had been sort of a technological revolution where drum machines came out and people were able to record things at home that I had been recording in the studio, so my workload fell off. But at the same time, the studios in Hollywood were getting very busy. They were sending movies to New York to get scored, but the movies were so bad that they didn't even send a mixer or recording engineer. And so they would call up the studio and say, hey, I hope you can find somebody for us to record this that can at least spell orchestra. And Don Fry, the manager of RCA, said, I got just the guy for you. So that's how I got involved in the film industry, making that transition. So I did a bunch of really crappy movies that I hope you've never seen. And then I got a phone call and says, hey, we're going to be starting an animated project pretty soon. Okay. And it was Beauty and the Beast. That took about a year and a half, maybe 2 years to do. I did almost all the songs in New York while John Richards was doing the score out here in California. And so I called him up and said, hey, eventually these things are going to collide on the screen, so let's talk about how we're doing it. So basically, how are you doing it? Because he was already, very involved in the film industry, so he gave me some helpful hints. And later on, we moved to California in '93 to try to be close to the film industry, and been here ever since. What is this, 2022, isn't it?
You mentioned both Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, both songs written by Alan Menken. What was the relationship like with him?
Actually, I had worked with Alan in the jingle industry prior to him becoming famous as a film composer. And he would write jingles, and I would record the demos for them, and so we got to know each other that way a little bit. When I was working with Alan on the film projects like Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, obviously there would be some preliminary discussion about what was going to happen, how we're going to do it. And unlike all the jingles that I had done, which was all to click track, the songs that we recorded for the animated pictures were all done live without click. And by live, I mean the orchestra, the soloists, the singers were all performing live without any kind of time reference. And the songs that Alan wrote were very complex, and they had a bunch of lines that you always have to be able to hear every syllable of every word of every line simultaneously. And I got to say, it was quite a challenge. So we spent a lot of time mixing those songs in New York.
You have a huge back catalogue of some of the biggest movies ever made, so there is so much to talk about. But can we start with your involvement with the Coen Brothers and Carter Burwell, the composer of the Coens movies?
I first met Carter on Miller's Crossing, and it was his first orchestral score. So he called up, as did Disney, he called up the guy at RCA, Don Fry, and said, hey, I'm going to be doing this thing. It's going to be orchestral, and this is going to be my first project, so can you help me out? So he hooked him up with a music editor, Todd Cassow, and me, and he introduced him to the contractors in town. So it all kind of came together on Miller's Crossing. And Carter's a very, very bright guy, and he learns things very quickly. He was I think it was a biology major at Harvard, and I could be wrong about that, but he was playing keyboard in a band, and that's how he got hooked up with the Coens by Skip Leavesay, the sound editor, saw him playing, and walked up to him and said, hey, would you like to do music for a movie, which was, I think, either Blood Simple, I think it was. And then he did Raising Arizona, and that was before he was exposed to me. And so that was before Carter could even spell SMPTE. So that was his introduction to film scoring, and then I got together with him on Miller's Crossing. And he relied very heavily on me as far as the technical stuff. But as we went along, he learned more and more about what we were doing. And originally he had other people doing the orchestration for him. And later on, he had started doing more orchestrations of his own. And he and I would talk about various things. Like a lot of his music is very stylized, and it has a particular idea behind it. So we would always talk about it ahead of time, and I would figure out exactly how we were going to get it done. And he is very receptive to my musical comments, which I always enjoyed.
How hands-on are the Coen Brothers with the mix? Obviously, tension is driven per the script, but I presume a scene can be completely changed just by that mix.
The Coen Brothers are always on a limited budget, so the the collaboration between the Coen Brothers and Carter ahead of time is always intense and very elaborate. So by the time we get to the studio, pretty much all the questions are answered, all the bumps are ironed out, and things are pretty much on schedule. Yes, the Coens attended the recordings. Sometimes both of them, sometimes only one, depending on what their schedule was. But as I said, most of the questions were already answered, and there was very little changing to be done during the recording. So generally, that's the way it works. The director is at the recording, but almost never at the music mix. But then the music goes on to another process of the dubbing stage. So the director is there again, trying to make sure that the music doesn't drown out the sound effects.
Can you talk about your favorite composers? I mean, you've worked with some of the greats, from Danny Elfman, Hans Zimmer, Christopher Young, Rob Zombie to Randy Newman. What stories or recollections do you have of your time working with these phenomenal composers?
You want to know the ones I want to kill?
Oh, yes, that's what we want to hear. That's the kind of stories we definitely want to hear on this podcast.
Well, I have the most experience with Carter, obviously, and we get along great. We have a very, very good interaction. He basically lets me do what I want to do, and then I ask him if it's matching his vision of the music, and then he makes some suggestions or requests about alterations, and we take care of that. Another project that I did early in the middle 80s was The Untouchables, which I did with Ennio Morricone, and that was a lot of fun. Did that in New York, and he was a former trumpet player, as was I, so we got along really well. But he spoke no English during the recording, and there was one time when I was saying, "Oh, looks like there's a wrong notes here in the viola part. Looks like they copied the viola part as though it were treble clef, and it's really alto clef, so that's why it's one pitch, one whole step off." So, and he said he wanted to be able to deal with it. He didn't want any kind of outside influence. But we got along great. During the mixing, he would actually move faders, turning the trumpets up, beat me to it. But, it was a lot of fun to work with him. He was a lot of fun. John Debney is great. I worked a lot with Christopher Young. I actually worked with John Barry once, I think. He was a real gentleman, a lot of fun.
Now, we talked earlier that you've also worked on some of the greatest Disney movies ever produced. Is the process slightly different working on a score as opposed to an underscore, or is the approach the same?
It is different. Obviously, the song will play a completely different role in the movie. It'll be front and center, basically. And the score can play anything from nearly front and center to completely invisible. So it runs the entire gamut of things. So the score is completely different. The songs, obviously, you have to treat as though they were going to be winding up on the radio, the top 40, because a lot of them do. And so you have to approach it with that concept in mind, and which is totally different from what the score is supposed to be doing.
Now, you've worked on many different genres of movies, from Disney to horror. Is there a genre that you really feel more at home with, or are you approaching different genres with a different approach?
I don't really have a preference. I approach each project from zero, starting from zero as far as what I'm expecting and what I plan, because I need to get with the composer and say, what is it we're trying to do, as I said before. So I treat each one differently. In fact, occasionally when I would come home from a jingle session, my wife would say, "What did you do today?" And instead of saying, "Oh, a Coke or Burger King," I would say, "Well, 2 guitars, a bass, a piano, and drums." That's what I did today. So that's how I approach the movies as well. It's all about the music, and has only peripherally to do with the style of the film itself. Obviously, that plays a role in the decisions that the composer will make and how I will treat the stuff. But as far as a preference, I don't have one. ultimately it is the composer's product, and I try really hard to make sure that they get what they want. Along the way, I have probably 80 to 90% freedom to make them, like I said, microphone selections, orchestra placement, as long as it will fulfill the needs ultimately of the composer. An example would be, what role is the harp going to play in this particular film? Oh, harp is going to be primarily solo instrument, in which case I would put it in a different place than if it was just part of the orchestra. So those are the decisions that I make in response to the composer's need. But he doesn't say, isolate the harp. He says, well, the harp is going to be a solo instrument, or the piano is going to be a solo instrument.
What project has been the most fun to work on?
It would probably be Beauty and the Beast. I think that was a real turning point for Disney. They paid a lot of attention to it. It was, I think, a wonderful movie, and everything about it was extremely well done, and I enjoyed every aspect of it. I enjoyed, believe it or not, dealing with the executives from Disney. They were cool, and dealing with the music staff of Alan and his crew, and all of that was good. It was one of my early ventures into film. It was something that was relatively easy for me because of my orchestral background, having sat in the orchestra and having sat in the audience listening to orchestras, so I knew exactly what it was supposed to sound like and what all the challenges of each instrument were going to be, so I was able to deal with all that. So I'd say Beauty and the Beast was probably the pinnacle of my appreciation of the films.
What film or composer really tested you? One that you really couldn't wait to get out of?
I did a couple of films with a composer whose hearing was failing, and it was a real challenge. It was a very small group. It was not an orchestra. It was like a small, diverse group, electric piano, a couple acoustic guitars, electric bass, a couple of other things. And he would come over to me and say, Mike, it sounds muddy, and I would analyze it, and it didn't sound muddy to me. So I would solo, the potential offenders, the electric piano, crystal clear, electric bass, spotless, the acoustic guitars, absolutely great. And so there was no element that would contribute muddiness to his perception. We went through that on a couple of sessions during the week, and then I went over to Signet Sound to mix it, and he was going to come over later in the afternoon. So I had mixed like a handful of cues, and he came by to hear a playback, and I played the stuff for him. He said, "Oh, shit, this sounds great. I should have listened to you." So I was glad to get out of that one.
You were part of the recording staff on the 80s classic children's TV show Thundercats. What memories do you have of that show?
Bernie Hoffer is the composer of that. And he and I had been working a lot on jingles. He was a jingle writer, and was working a lot with the company that I was working for. So I would see him 2 or 3 times a week, and he said, "Hey, Mike, we're going to do this TV show." Okay. And he said, "It's going to be called Thundercats." Whatever. And so we recorded a whole bunch of cues for it over the space of a week, using the same players that we were using for the jingles all week. And basically, they just show up at night, and we'd do these things. I don't think I ever saw the show. My kids did.
Now, technology has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. I assume from when you started to where we are now that the processes may have changed over those years alongside that technology that you use. So can you talk about that and where you started to where we are now in your home studio?
I got into pro audio in 1972, which is, don't count it, it's 50 years ago, the way I do math. So over the last 50 years, a lot has changed. We opened the first 16-track studio in Indiana, and it was in Indianapolis. And it was obviously analog, and we were track limited. We had 16 tracks, so only one machine, and when you run out of tracks, that's the end of the session. So the challenges back then were formidable, and the tape manufacturers would come out with new formulations, every 6 months or every year or something. Ampex and Scotch were the two primary vendors. And tape noise was a large factor in everything that we did. And I was very sensitive to tape noise, so it was something that I tried to guard against constantly. And the way you do that is by recording with high levels. The drawback to recording with high levels is print through, because the tape lies one layer on top of another, and the magnetism is shared. So if you have a big brass hit at the beginning of a tune, and you listen to the count off going into the downbeat, you can hear the brass section coming over the hill. Ba-dap, 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 ba-dap. So this is print through. And that was a challenge. A lot of people don't talk about that, but it, is obviously muddying the entire sound. Later on, noise reduction came into play, Dolby A, and then Dolby SR. Dolby A was a big step forward. SR was nearly magical. It was, a very large leap into the future. And by this time, we were using 24-track recorders. Here's a little anecdote for you. Back in the 24-track days of analog, while I was in New York, one of the things we would do would be to overdub percussion. And there was a guy named Jimmy Malin who was a great percussionist, but we were track limited, like I said. So he would play conga with one hand and tambourine with the other hand on his knee on the same pass. So we'd have one percussion track with conga and tambourine on it. And so I would listen to what he was doing. I'd say, "Hey, Jimmy, you got too much tambourine." So he would, move his leg out like that. So we would balance it like that. So that was, one aspect of the technology at the time. And then later on, we were able to link more than one machine together, which was great in terms of track count, but the noise builds up quite dramatically. Then digital came along, and it was only 44.1, and it was 32 tracks. And so we did a lot of things like that. And I think we might have even recorded Beauty on that. I can't remember exactly. But, that was about the period where it was coming into play. Sony digital recorders, which was like a 1-inch tape, but 48 tracks of digital, which was 44.1 or 48K. And that was really terrific. We liked that a lot. We were doing ethnic instrument overdubs in Dublin for the movie Rob Roy. And it came time to do the Ilian pipes, which is sort of like bagpipes, but rather than blowing into them, you're inflating it with a pump under your arm, the Ilian pipes. And Carter played the demo for Davey Spillane, who was going to be playing the pipes. And so Davey listened to the demo, and he said, "Oh, lovely, it's a beautiful melody. It's great, Carter. It's really terrific. But in this particular key, the 7th scale degree is only flat. It's not natural. So we only have a minor 7th rather than a major 7th in this particular key. So what are we going to do about that?" And our solution was to record it with the wrong note on the 7th scale degree, and then go back, very speed the tape down a half step, play it again, and every time the 7th scale degree, I was watching the score, every time the 7th scale degree would come up, I would punch in and out on the recorder, and there was this destructive recording. You screw it up, it's permanently screwed up. You can't undo. So that was one thing that we did. But we don't have that limitation anymore because of the technology with Pro Tools, I guess. So Pro Tools you can undo and, cut and paste, move things around, all sorts of crazy stuff.
Hey Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show. You're so cool.
Marc, thanks for coming to my humble studio here. It's been great chatting with you.
Hey guys, we hope you enjoyed today's show. Michael was so great to chat with, and after our interview, he was kind enough to record a small masterclass in sound engineering a track, which you can check out straight after this. So before I bid you a fond farewell for now, don't forget to click that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing. We look forward to seeing you all again on the next exciting episode, and don't forget, you're so cool.
In my career, I've had to deal with a whole variety of musical styles, like this tune. This is The Heat Is On from Beverly Hills Cop. Very stylized, very well produced. And let me show you what the original sounded like. Okay, so that's the original. Now what happens is I get a bunch of tracks, some synth, some live performances, and then I have to create the same kind of musical vibe as the original. And I don't really try to imitate it 100%, but I do try to put everybody in the same musical framework as the original. The elements that I got to work with, this is with no processing, so let's see how this sounds raw.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat, the beat's so loud.
Not too bad. Let's see what it takes to get from here to the final product. After all the processing that I did, here is the way it winds up.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat, the beat's so loud, deep inside, the pressure's high, just to stay alive, 'cause the heat is on.
Okay, so let's figure out how we got from one to the other. Here are all the drum tracks that I got with no processing at all. Okay, not bad, but certainly not anything like what the original sounded like. So let's do some processing on these guys. Okay, quite a difference. The first thing I did was I brought down the room mics to make the drums sound a little bit more present, not totally 100% present, but a little bit more present than they were. And EQ on the snare and little particular reverb treatment on the snare drum as well to try to create that vibe that the original had. Okay, so let's take a look at the solo saxophone here. This is a very prominent element in the song, and I'll turn off the processing. Okay, so the original sounds a good bit brighter than that, so I'm going to add some brightening EQ and slightly thinning EQ. So here's what that sounds like. And another thing that we did was to add a little delay. Delay is cool. And in addition to the delay, we added a little bit of reverb. Kind of cool. So here's how it fits in. Pretty cool. I like that. All right, let's keep it. What do you say? All right, the next thing to deal with is the vocal. And take all the processing off the vocal. And here's what the vocal sounded like.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat, and the beat's so loud.
Sounds terrific, but I think it needs to be a little bit brighter, and the dynamics need to be calmed down a little bit so that it sits in the track perfectly. So here's the equalization.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay, that's really well on the way. Another thing I did was add a little parallel processing. Here it is with that.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay. All right, and the next thing we need to do is to calm down the dynamic range a little bit.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay, used a chain of compressors here. One thing that's happening is that this processing is starting to emphasize the high frequencies, like the S's, the sibilants. So let's calm those down a little bit with a little de-esser.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay, that's well under control. Now what we need to do now is to do one more little thing on the dynamic range, the vocal rider. So that'll bring down the peak information and bring up the low-level information. So it'll even it out just a little bit.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay, that sounds a little active when it's soloed, but when it's not soloed.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay, so that's sitting pretty nicely. The only thing we haven't done is add a little reverb to it. So here's what that sounds like.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay, cancel the solo, and here's what the whole thing sounds like.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay, so we heard a little B3 action there. Let's see what the B3 is up to. Okay, I love B3s. They're great. So here's the processing I'm doing on that. Just a little bit of roll off on the low end, a little bit of brightening, no gain reduction at all. and a little reverb. So that's what's happening with that. So here's that in the mix.
The heat is on.
Pretty cool, huh? Then we have the guitars. Okay, so they're doing basically what they need to be doing. And then down here we have a little guitar solo action. Pretty cool. Don't really need to do much to that. Here's what it sounds like in the mix. I'll back it up before the sax solo. Okay, we're really getting there. So what's the last thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that the level will not be a problem when we stream it. And the way I figure that out is by using a couple of different loudness meters. This is a free one, Ulean loudness meter 2, free it says right here. So let's take it back to the beginning. The color threshold set at, let's make it -14. All right, so -14 is the target for many of these streaming services. So let's see how this fits in.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat.
Okay, so this is working really well. So the integrated loudness LUFS is -12.8, and the Spotify and YouTube and people like that say they're looking for -14. -12.8 is darn close to that. And it also means that they're not going to apply any compression to raise the volume. So if we printed this at -18, for instance, they would have to bring the level up by 4 dB, which means they'd be using their compressor and their processing, and we don't like that. We'd rather do it ourselves. So all they have to do is turn it down, what is this, 1.2 dB. I think that's pretty cool. All right, so how do we do that? There's a million different ways to do it. The thing that I have chosen is a multi-band limiter, the L3, multi-maximizer they call it. So let's see what this is doing.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every.
The limiter's not really doing all that much, as you can see. So all we're really doing is making sure that the level is exactly right for the streaming services. So that's it. So let's take one more listen to the original and see if we have created that vibe.
The heat is on the street, inside your head, on every beat, and the beats alive.
Okay, so that's the original. Sounds pretty good. I like that song. Let's see if we came close. Okay, I think we did pretty well, and that sounds really good. It reminds me a lot of the original song, and as I said, we're not really trying to make it exactly the same. We want people to have the same reaction to our version of the song, our cover version of the song, as they do when they hear the original song, only with better audio. Okay, so that's what we're aiming to do. Thank you.